Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, and there's going to be times when you're going to have to hold your finger there as we will shift away from Hebrews chapter 11 and then come back to it. Thank you for that wonderful song, Service Harris. That song has become to me more and more to me, because if he had not arose from the grave, where would we be? Maybe I need to change my sermon. We'd be lost if he had not arose from the grave. And I am grateful that he did come out of the grave. And I'm grateful for all of you. And I want to thank you. You have helped me, mold me to be a better minister since I've been here. And I thank you all for your wise counsel, your guidance, and instruction. And as we move on into the finality of Hebrews chapter 11, we won't be done with the series, because there's something important that comes right after Hebrews chapter 11, and I'd be amiss if I did not preach on that subject of the first probably 3 or 4 verses of Hebrews chapter 12, but we won't look into that tonight. We are going to finish from verses 33 through chapter 40, well, that might be bad, through verse 40. We're going to go through those 7 verses, if you will. We left off last Sunday night looking at David and Samuel, but there is a phrase there, and the prophets. It says, and the prophets, and that's very important because most of what we are going to be looking at tonight is a reference to the prophets. A reference to the prophets. Now, when we think of the prophets, most of them were writers. Not all of them, but most of them were writers. Some of them even had scribes. Jeremiah had Baruch as his scribe, as you find in Jeremiah 32, 12 through 16, and Jeremiah 36. He talks about how Baruch wrote for him, much like Paul did at times, had someone write for him. Moses and Samuel were considered prophets. Although Samuel was a judge and Moses was a lawgiver, they were both considered prophets. Of course, I'd be amiss if I didn't talk about the major prophets. Remind you of those in our Bibles. There are 4 major prophets. They are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And of course, we know Jeremiah wrote another book, a companion volume, Lamentations. Also the minor prophets. I'm not going to try to quote those off the top of my head because I know I won't get them right. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then there were the non-writing prophets. Elijah was a non-writing prophet. We don't have anything that he wrote. Elisha was a non-writing prophet. Nathan was a non-writing prophet. Also, Micaiah, as we will see him tonight in 1 Kings 22, was a non-writing prophet. But they were all prophets that spoke, and there are many more that we can't mention tonight for time's sake. So what we're going to do is some of what we will see tonight probably refers back to some that have already been mentioned who are not prophets, but some will be a reference to prophets that haven't been mentioned yet. So what I want to do is break this down into 2 points. 2 points. The faith of the anonymous victors, and then the faith of the anonymous sufferers. So we're going to look at that tonight. We'll break it down in verse 33 and 34, and then 35 through the end of the chapter. All right. As we look at 33 and 34, here the writer, he just starts bang, 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 just laying things out, but he's not very specific. He's very general, but some of the events are very specific as to who they refer to. Some it's very easy to point out who he's talking about, and some not so much. So we will speculate a little bit tonight as we look through these. Here we have in verse 33, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. So we see in verse 33, those who had subdued kingdoms. Well, some of those already mentioned. Gideon subdued kingdoms. Barak, we talked about that. He subdued kingdoms with God's help and Deborah's help. Samson subdued the Philistines. He subdued kingdoms, as well as Jephthah. Those judges had subdued kingdoms. Also David, surely he subdued kingdoms in all of his conquests. And of course Joshua, he would have been one that would have subdued kingdom as well. worked righteousness. Well, Samuel and David definitely worked righteousness. Now, you might be thinking, well, they worked. What this is really referring to is not this idea that some of us can have, if we're not careful, of earning salvation, but it's more about being fair and just. And you find in 1 Samuel 12, I'm not going to read these passages because I want to read some others, 1 through 5, as well as David in 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 15, you find that they were both fair. They were both just. And that's something we need in our world, especially within the Lord's church. We need to be fair and just with each other. We need to be that way. And that requires us to listen to one another. Listening to one another, that is vital for the Lord's church. And being able to talk. Had a wonderful conversation with a young lady that came to my office about something that was said in a sermon. It was just so good to be able to just talk. No raised voices, just talked. Everything was great. Obtain promises. I do want us to see 1 Kings chapter 8. 1 Kings chapter 8, a beautiful passage in 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 56. Almost everyone obtained some promises, but here we find, blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people, Israel, according to all that he promised. There has not failed one word of all his good promise. Did you get that? Not failed not one of his good words, of his promise. Does that not help your faith to know that you serve a God that not one word of his good promises fail? Man, that is awesome. But let's go on. Which he promised through his servant Moses. So we find that almost all these people obtained promises, but now they didn't obtain the promise. We have. In the sense, we're a little more blessed, if you will, because we've obtained the promise of who? Jesus Christ, the coming Messiah. And we're so blessed in that regard. And then we have stopped the mouths of lions. Now, do I even have to say anything? Daniel comes to our minds, right? If you look at Daniel 6, 22 through 23, King Cyrus, I believe it was, or Darius, it doesn't matter. But anyway, he came and he was so distraught because he had been tricked into throwing Daniel into the lion's den. And you know when he came up there, he said, an angel of the Lord came and he shut the mouths of the lions. But now, is he the only one that stopped the mouths of lions? No. Did David not say he had killed a lion and a bear? Is that not stopping the mouth of a lion? Did Samson kill a lion with his bare hands? He stopped the mouth of the lions too. So there are more, but definitely, I believe there's no doubt this is a reference to Daniel. But there are others as well. Let's look at verse 34. Again with these victors. Quench the violence of fire. Escape the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong. Became valiant in battle. Turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Now that is not talking about people from outer space. I know we all know that. It's talking about foreigners. Foreigners to those who would have been against those of God's people. So here's another both specific and general statement made that can apply to multiple people. Of course, quenching the violence of fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego should come to our minds. Hananiah, as their Israelite names are, Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we should know them because I think they would rather be called by that than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because those are names which would honor the gods that they were in captive to. So you can find that in Daniel 3, 23 through 28. I'll just say something brief about that. We all, I think most of us remember Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah standing up against King Nebuchadnezzar because he told them, if you will not bow down to me and my big image that I've set up, then you will be thrown into the fire. And they said, we will not. Our God will deliver us one way or the other. Either physically or spiritually, we will be delivered. There was complete trust in God. And that's what it's all about. That's what this whole chapter is about. People living their faith. And these people did that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah did that. They said, look, throw us in. And we know he turned it up 7 times hotter than it was. It was so hot that the people that threw them in were consumed by the heat, and they came out not even smelling. There was an angel of the Lord that appeared to be a son of the gods, because he didn't know who Jesus was. I know we talk about that, but he didn't know who Jesus was at the time. But anyway, he sees this image in there with them, protecting them, and they came out without even the smell of smoke. Now, have you ever been around a campfire? You can't get around a fire and not smell like smoke. And especially me, because every time I get around the campfire, I can move. It doesn't matter where I move, smoke follows me. So you've been warned, if we have a weenie roast, don't get around me or you're going to be smelling like smoke. Escape the edge of the sword. David and Goliath. David escaped the edge of the sword of Goliath. And Saul. Wasn't Saul trying to kill him most of his life? So David would be one of those. Elijah and Jezebel, she wanted him dead. Remember Elijah in the cave and hid? After Jezebel had put it out, you're a dead man. Wanted dead or dead, you're a dead man. And then we have Elisha and Jezebel's son Jehoram. Same situation. Jeremiah and Jehoiakim. He's going to kill him. Going to kill him. Also, Esther and Haman, and isn't that a beautiful story of one who could have been killed but was delivered because of her faith. And then we have out of weakness made strong. David comes to my mind, a young lad, weak, but he was strong in faith. So strong in faith as he went up against Goliath. Samson, of course, his eyes were put out, his hair was cut off. He was made weak, but because he put his faith back in God in the end, he was made strong. And then Hezekiah comes to my mind as one who was told he was going to die, and he pleaded with God, and he was made strong again, that he would live longer, and the prayer was answered that he had prayed. Valiant in battle, turning away the armies. Well, Israel all the time were turning away the flights. When their faith was right, they were turning away the armies. And this can go, most scholars say this goes all the way into the intertestamental period, where the Jews would fight in the Maccabean revolt. And I don't want to get too much into that, although we will make some comments in just a few minutes. All right, so those are the faith of the anonymous victors, if you will. No names are given here, but we can kind of get an idea of who they're talking about. Now let's look at 35 through 38. 35 through 38. We find in verse 35, I'm going to go ahead and just read all these. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings. That was country, by the way. Mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth, and all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. Now, women received their dead raised to life again. It's hard not to think of the widow of Zarephath with Elijah. You remember Elijah was told to go to Zarephath and meet this widow, and she had a son, and you know it was a famine at that time, and it was tough times, and Elijah came there, and if you remember, this is on record in 1 Kings 17 through 24, but he came there and he said, would you fix me some bread? And if you remember, she said, I've got just enough for me and my son. We're going to eat, and then we're going to die, because we're going to starve to death. That's how bad it is. He said, you fix me something. If you remember, the oil and the flour never would run out. But then the son got sick. He got sick and he died. And of course, you know that made Elijah feel horrible, and he talked about that to God. Look, you brought me here with this woman who's been hospitable to me. We have a miracle here that you have performed, but now you let the son die. And then, if you remember, he prayed to God. He laid over him 3 times, and he was brought back to life. So that widow received her dead son raised to life again. And then in 2 Kings 4:18 through 37, you have the Shunammite woman by Elisha. And this is a little more drawn out story, and that would be probably need a whole sermon on that one because of the length of it, and I'm not going to read it all, but it's the same situation. The son was raised there, and it was just a beautiful story. I would urge you to read that. But women received their dead raised to life again. Then in verse 35, also we have others were tortured. They willfully accepted being tortured to death. Understand this word here is tupanum. Tupanum, and it's literally a drum, a wheel-like structure where people were tied on it and were beaten to death. So this is a very violent situation here. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they may obtain a better resurrection. They would give up what this life had for the next life. They understood that there was something better, and we've said that over and over. And we have people in record. You have to go into the intertestamental period in 2 Maccabees 6:18 through 31. Eleazar the scribe was killed on the tupanum. He was strapped over the drum or wheel or whatever it was that they used there and beat to death because he would not defile himself by eating pork. Unclean meat at that time. And he was 90 years old. So old people, whoever you are, I'm not pointing fingers, you can set an example. He did. And a mother, we have in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, a mother and her 7 sons chose this violent death on the tupanum as well, rather than live out and betray God. So, beautiful pictures here. Then we have mockings, scourgings in verse 36, chains and imprisonment. And you find in Acts 7:52, we talked a little bit about that this morning when Stephen was preaching that beautiful historical lesson to the Sanhedrin council, reminding them, and he said, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? Basically, almost all of them. They persecuted them. And they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one. So here we have some of these people. And I would invite your attention over to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 22. I told you Micaiah. We have him on record here in 1 Kings 22. Where he took mockings and scourgings. 1 Kings 22, verses 24 through 28, it says, Now Zedekiah, the son of Chenaniah, went near and struck Micaiah on the cheek and said, Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you? And Micaiah said, Indeed, you shall see on the day when you go into an inner chamber to hide. So the king of Israel said, Take Micaiah and return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, the king's son, and say, Thus says the king, Put this fellow in prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction, until I come in peace. But Micaiah said, If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me. And he said, Take heed, all you people. And we find another one that suffered imprisonment, especially for not doing anything wrong, especially doing something very right, was Joseph. It's hard not to think of Joseph with Potiphar's wife, and we know that story very well, how she tried to seduce him in Genesis 39 and verse 20, and he used the geographic solution. He put some distance between him and the temptation. And that's the best thing you can do. When it comes to that situation, he ran so fast that he left his outer garment. Of course, she used that as evidence that he surely tried to come on to her, and he was thrown in prison for that. And I want us to visit again. We looked at Jeremiah this morning. I want us to revisit Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 20, I tell you, the more you read about the prophets, the more you see suffering people. People that were willing to suffer just to preach God's Word, just to proclaim God's Word. And we find Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 20 and verse 2, it says here, now Pashur, I'm going to wait, I hear some pages turning. Now Pashur struck Jeremiah the prophet and put him in the stocks that were in the high gate of Benjamin, which was by the house of the Lord. So he was put in chains and he was beaten. We also find in Jeremiah 37 and verse 15, there's much about him, all the suffering that Jeremiah went through. He wasn't called the weeping prophet for nothing. It says in verse 15 of Jeremiah 37, therefore the princes were angry with Jeremiah, and they struck him, and they put him in prison in the house of Jonathan the scribe, for they had made that the prison. Then you find in 38, 6 through 13, where it says, so they took Jeremiah and cast him into the dungeon of Malchiah, the king's son, in the court of the prison, and they let Jeremiah down with ropes, and in the dungeon there was no water but mire. We know what gumbo's like when it's real nasty and stinky. He was in the mire. So Jeremiah sank in the mire. Now Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs, who was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon. When the king was sitting at the gate of Benjamin, Ebed-Melech went out of the king's house and spoke to the king, saying, my lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon. And he is likely to die from hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city. Then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, saying, take from here 30 men with you and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he died. So Ebed-Melech took the men with him and went into the house of the king under the treasury and took their old clothes and old rags and let them down by ropes into the dungeon with Jeremiah. Then Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian said to Jeremiah, please put these old clothes and rags under your armpits, under the ropes. And Jeremiah did so. So they pulled Jeremiah up with ropes and lifted him out of the dungeon. And Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. Just horribly mistreated. We can't imagine the horrible mistreatment of God's special spokesman. Then when you go back to verse 37, you find those who were stoned, those who were sawn in two, and those who were slain with the sword. Now while we're in the Old Testament, look up 2 Chronicles chapter 24. 2 Chronicles chapter 24. We're getting our history lesson tonight. Is that okay? If you don't like history, just bear with it. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 20 and 21, we find Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, but we find here how he was stoned. And in verse 20 through 21, it says, then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, who stood above the people and said to them, thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he also has forsaken you. So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. He was stoned in the temple of all places. And Jesus, this was so important to Jesus that he even made mention of it in Matthew chapter 23. We find in Matthew 23 verses 35 through 37, and this was a picture of the Jews. It says there that on on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. What did Jesus? He didn't say that they were justified in stoning him. He said, you murdered him. He was murdered there. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stone those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. So we find Zechariah. Of course, Jeremiah, we talked about how he was exiled into Egyptian captivity with a remnant there, and by tradition he was stoned as well in Egypt. And then we have, again, there is no biblical record of anyone being sawn in two, but if you go into the historical record by tradition, I don't know that this is true, I'm not claiming it to be true, but Isaiah was sawn in two with a wooden sword. That's gruesome. No matter what you think of a wooden saw, it would be bad enough with a metal saw, but the wooden saw by Manasseh. Now, I don't know that to be the case, but somebody did because the Bible says it happened, right? So we know for sure somebody did, but by tradition, Isaiah. Then the prophets under Ahab, it says there that Jezebel massacred the prophets there. It was so bad that Obadiah took 100 and hid them in one cave, and another 100 prophets and hid them in another cave. And we know what Elijah, of course, he went to his own cave and threw his pity party, and we remember all that. But they were massacred. That's a graphic word there that the Bible uses in 1 Kings 18 and verse 4. Also, as another record of it in 1 Kings 19, 10 through 14. But another one here who was slain with the sword was Uriah under Jehoiakim. We find in Jeremiah 26, 20 through 23. I won't read that one. But basically, when he was threatened, he ran off to Egypt. Jehoiakim was brutal. He sent people and got him from Egypt, brought him back, and they killed him with the sword, it says. So these people, these righteous sufferers, just doing it because they were what? Living their faith. They trusted in God. They were living by faith and living their faith. And we find, if we go back to Hebrews as we get ready to wrap this up, chapter 11, in verse 37 and 38, they were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were slain with the sword, and they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. Now the sheepskin and goatskin, that was the typical wear for the prophets, because most of the prophets, if you want to study it, I got some passage, but it was typical in 1 Kings 17, 3 through 9, also in Zechariah 13 and verse 4. That was typical attire. And even in the New Testament, although it was still under the law of Moses, who do we know that dressed like that was a prophet? John the Baptist. John the Baptist was like that as well. But these prophets were outcast from society, much like maybe we need to be as well. And they usually live privately, and you find Jesus making reference to this, even about himself in in Luke chapter 9, verses 57 and 58. We have a reference that Jesus makes. He says, "Now it happened as they journeyed on the road that someone said to him, 'Lord, I will follow you wherever you go.' And Jesus said to him, 'Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.'" So Jesus himself, being a prophet, was like that as well. And you find here God's testimony about these people. He said the world isn't worthy of these people that are willing to suffer because of their faith. The world's not worthy of them. And let us live our lives so that God would look at us and say, the world's not worthy of them, as they live their faith and demonstrate it to others through their actions, how they show their faith by their actions. All right, as we look at the very end here in verse 39, and all these having obtained a good testimony, how? Through faith, did not receive the promises. We don't have to really talk about works. We don't have to talk about those things, about obedience, when you have true faith. Because when you have true faith, you have genuine faith, what's going to happen? Are works going to be an issue? Nope. Is it obedience going to be an issue? Nope. Because your faith is right. When our faith is right, everything falls into place. When our true trust is in God, everything falls into place, and we are promised, just like these people, a good testimony through faith. But these people didn't receive the promise. We have. And we find in verse 40, God having provided something better for us. That's for the Hebrew audience, and guess what? It's for you and me. He's provided something better. And every one of us, if you go to Jeremiah chapter 34, 31, I can't remember off the top of my head, and Hebrews chapter 8, we live under a better covenant with better promises. Aren't you glad that we live under this covenant of Jesus Christ, this covenant of grace and mercy? But one day, all the Old Testament faithful and all the New Testament faithful are going to be made perfect together. And one day, when Jesus comes back, if we have lived by faith, we will go to meet Him in there. And there we will be with Him forever. If anybody has need of the invitation tonight, whether it be you have sin in your life that you need to repent of, or whether it be that you have the need to obey the gospel, whatever it is, we're here to serve you as together we stand and sing.